This is going to be a little bit more of a casual video today because I just finished a draft of a screenplay, and honestly I'm just trying to take a couple of days off from really working on it. I felt a little bit overwhelmed after completing that draft. It was a first draft of a story. Really it was a second iteration of a story, but I've been working on this draft of it for over a year. It's been a long time coming on that one. A little bit discouraging because I felt like at the end of the day it really only was maybe 3 or 4 weeks of work on the screenplay. That was kind of spread out throughout the course of a year. And I was like, why did it take me so long to get this done? Just not being very disciplined in it. And I've just been thinking about how I want my rewrites to go better and faster to iterate upon it. There's some elements of the story where, thinking back on it, there are maybe some key relationships that I felt like didn't really sprout into everything that I wanted them to in the story. And then, just some of the themes, some of the visuals I felt like just needed to come through stronger. So I kind of noted down some of the things I want to be stronger in some of my rewrites. But I was feeling a little bit overwhelmed on okay, where do I go next? What's my direction for this rewrite? How do I really get that accomplished, especially if I believe it's right to start a rewrite in a fresh document and not just tweak what I already have. Anyways, I was listening to episode 116 of the Screenwriting Life podcast last night, which the title is How to Stay Focused and Motivated Through Rewrites. I was listening to this podcast and I felt like it had some interesting insight into just how to stay focused during rewrites, but specifically this concept called picking a pony, which they talk about in the episode. Really the entire idea of this is that especially in early drafts, you can tend to shove all of your ideas into one story because you're going to care about all of these ideas. But the idea of picking a pony, especially in the context of a rewrite, is kind of choosing your guiding light, choosing your beacon that's no, this is the thing that every decision has to adhere to. This is what we're going to stick to try to guide the next iteration of the story. Something that I really liked that they said was that maybe we should stop calling these drafts of your story, but call them versions of your story. In this podcast, the two leads of the podcast are people who have worked at Pixar on specifically the writers of Inside Out and Up, I think. And they talked about how at a certain point when the movie actually came out, they lost they lost track of what version of the movie actually was released to the public. And that's just very interesting because I've really, in my mind, I guess I've thought of redrafting as a very iterative thing, I think it is valuable to think about drafting or writing versions as separate exercises, and kind of the point of picking a pony is saying, okay, let's choose what we want the center of this story to be and write it in that way, or change what the center is and try writing it in this way for a draft, or at least outlining it in that way. And really putting that stress on that pony will show you for both your interest and just the logistics of the story if it actually has the mileage to be your pony in that way. I wrote down a couple of notes from the podcast that I thought were pretty interesting. Really the first note was that you're going to overstuff your story with all of your ideas in your first draft. So if you don't pick a pony, then maybe unconsciously or unintentionally your story is going to be a lot weaker because you're still going to be holding on to all of that. So you just need to be very intentional with choosing your pony and actually continuing with that guiding light. It can be pretty challenging to actually adhere your entire story to one pony, but I think that is where things actually come into really great writing, is things where every single little puzzle piece seems to fit within the theme, and within the log line, the philosophical conflict, whatever it is. So really putting your story through the stress test of one pony or another, one direction or another, is going to be pretty important. And I think kind of doing these exercises will help you find what is the best direction for your story. So I don't know, in my story, in the screenplay I've been writing, it's a little bit of an ensemble cast, and this is something they talked about specifically with ensembles in the podcast, was like, yes, it's fine to have a lot of characters and everything, but like it still has to revolve around the core. Like, what is that one core relationship that is actually the driving force of the movie? Because granted, there are anthologies and things like that, maybe there are exceptions to this, but really there needs to still be that thing that is the one binding force of the movie, and everything else can complement that. It can still be in the movie, but like, you need to know what the focus is. It's not that you have to spell it out for the audience within like the first 10 minutes of the movie or anything, but it's like, at least from the writer's intention perspective, we need to know what our intention is. We need to know what the core of it actually is when we're moving forward, right? Something they said too was like, if you choose a pony that you think is something you like, but as you go with it, it starts to burn out and it's really just not like carrying the weight that it needs to, the inclination will be to start pouring all of that random stuff, all of your old ideas back into it again. And that's really the sign that like, that's not what the core of the movie should be, which is an interesting observation, because I do think that there's like, in their podcast, they call it putting yourself in the lava, like going through that bit of like emotional vulnerability in your writing that you really don't want to have to face. But it's like, if you don't go through that lava with your pony and like really like force yourself to get through it, like, you'll never know if it actually will hold up or not. And I think it's interesting that like putting one direction like all the way through its paces will show whether or not it has that depth. And I mentioned this is the second iteration of the story I'm writing, and it's an interesting thing because the second iteration has a different protagonist. It has a different core relationship than my original draft did. I ended up changing it because I was like, through the process of writing the first draft, I was like, this is just not who we should be following. So I feel like I've already done a little bit of that. It's something I kind of wrote down, just building off of some things they said, but I think the discipline found within trimming the fat from your pony is hard, but I do think that for good writers, you should know that those ideas aren't necessarily lost. It's not that you can never write those, but I do think that like cutting them from a story when they don't fit perfectly, when they're just kind of like an addition, is honestly good for those ideas, because I think if you were to leave them in there but they didn't like quite benefit the overall story, honestly that's just a disservice to those ideas, in my opinion. And I think that like keeping them in a vault of like 4 later ideas, I really believe that there will be an opportunity in some story down the line, if you write consistently, where those ideas will be able to be reincorporated into something where they actually fit in better, and like they're far more meaningful in a different context. Something I thought that was interesting was they talked about how ponies, or your direction in your story, is really a contract with the audience. So it was like the first act of a film is the process of setting up what your contract is. You're setting out your proposal to the audience of like, hey, these are the characters, this is the journey they're going to go on, this is the unfamiliar situation that's been presented to them, that in the second and third act they're going to have to go out, adapt to, and conquer. And that is the process of showing them like what the center of your story is, what the pony of the story is. And then if you were to completely change that pony later in the movie, then that could lead to dissatisfaction. And that's not to say that you can't have like twists or anything like that, or like big story beats, but regardless, it's like you need to have that central theme. And I do think that that's interesting, thinking about that. But I think like changing your log line, changing your pony in this case, could be an interesting idea to try to stress test your film to find like what really the most durable and the most interesting just kind of core of your film could be. They talked about at Pixar how they would hang one word on the wall at the beginning of like in the conceptual phase for a film. So it's like, you know, I think they were talking about it in the context of Nemo. They hung like one word on the wall, which every single writer in the room, like all of their words had to be in tune with trying to chase that one word. And they were saying that like that's too broad for like a pony or something like that. But it's like that's kind of like a thematic barrier to give you a direction, and then like it'll kind of shape the bucket over time where all the ideas pour into, and you kind of find your nugget inside of there. So either way, like finding a guiding light, a guiding word, image, whatever it is, just something that will really like hone in the entire experience, and like just exercising it. They talked about at Pixar how their leader there, their creative leader, was like, hey, do this exercise. Like, this doesn't have to be in the movie, but like really thinking about writing as an exercise in a lot of ways is something I struggle with, because it's like, okay, I always want my writing to be just like, oh, this is the story, right? I don't want to write a version of the story that I don't want the story to be, right? Like, why would I write that? But I do think that that's something I need to grow in, because I do think there's value to putting your characters through other situations that they otherwise wouldn't be in, changing who the protagonist is, changing what that core is, changing kind of like what the crux of the story is, to see like what actually holds up and like where it will take the characters. I don't know. Really, like, wrapping all of this back up, I guess I'm just talking about in the light of doing a rewrite. There are multiple things in my screenplay right now that I felt like I didn't really nail. But instead of like just broadly going back in and trying to fix all of this, I think I need to reiterate like what the core of the story is, and I think I should choose a different direction than what the original direction was in this draft. Need to write a different version of the story so that I can really put the characters through their paces and make sure that the central relationships are something that hold up. So yeah, I guess I would recommend listening to that podcast. I found it kind of helpful for framing it in my mind. I'm sure this is a very casual video, and I'm sure they did a way better job explaining it than I have here. But I guess, yeah, just be specific when you're doing a rewrite. Think about it as a different version of your story. And don't try to rewrite the same thing but better, but write a different version, write a new movie. Like, it should not be the same movie, and you should then be able to compare and contrast, okay, which one was stronger, like which one was more intentional, which one had more fat. And I think that that's kind of an interesting exercise. Man, with that, I guess I'm going to finish taking this day off, and then I'm going to get back to some writing tomorrow. Yeah, sorry, this is kind of like a not as much of a produced video, but hopefully you still get something out of it. I have some more videos coming up that are a little higher produced on the formatting of screenplays and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm going to do some stuff on dialogue as well soon. So yeah, hope y'all enjoyed that. I hope your writing is going well. If you enjoyed the video or found it informative, consider leaving it a like or subscribing. Leave me some constructive criticisms in the comments below if you thought it could have been better. Yeah, man. I mean, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time. Bye, guys.